Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Partnerships and Global Engagement at National Security Council. Stephanie Smith, Senior Vice President and Head of MasterCard Community Pass Partnerships at MasterCard. And moderator Allison Carlson, Executive Vice President of FP Analytics and Events at Foreign Policy, to discuss the role of partnerships in achieving inclusive growth.
Good morning, everyone. Great to see you here. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks again to everyone online for tuning in. It's been an incredible morning so far with really insightful comments and discussions and lessons learned about the role of partnerships in foreign policy, in development, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to have the discussion we're about to have in the ways in which partnerships are absolutely vital to foreign policy and to inclusive growth. Amanda, I'd like to kick off by starting with you. So we know that the Biden-Harris administration has been very forward-leaning as it relates to partnerships and their role in foreign policy and national security, and also that partnerships are part of the national security strategy. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of level set for our audience here, why are they so vital to national security? And having led global partnerships for 3 years now, how are you seeing them be impactful?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much to Foreign Policy, to Department of State and USAID for pulling this group together. As you said, from the very sort of early foundational policy documents of this administration, there's been a real sense that we need to elevate the role of public-private partnership and ensure that our federal agencies, all of our practitioners feel both resourced and empowered to use this tool. I think there are a number of reasons. I think we have all seen that the budget environment in federal government has never been less predictable. I also think that we're seeing the sorts of challenges that really can't be tackled by just one type of actor, particularly the government actors. We have partners who have capacity that we don't have. They have access to technology we don't have. They have presence on the ground in places, wisdom. There are strategic partnerships that would be sort of inconceivable without us being kind of partnership-minded and open to this. In terms of the most impactful partnerships, I could never choose a favorite child, but I was speaking to someone recently who said partnerships sometimes are like a dinner and sometimes they're like a marriage. So we've seen extremely successful, very short-term partnerships. I think about the APEC Summit, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit last fall, where our goal was to communicate and reassert U.S. leadership in the Asia-Pacific region, to communicate the value proposition that the United States brings as a partner. And a huge part of that is our private sector. And so being able to generate and announce over $50 billion in new private sector investments and initiatives that supported the big APEC goals, economic inclusion, sustainability, and others, was a huge boon, and something that, given the composition of APEC, which includes Russia and China and others, it would have been really tough for just the government actors alone to make really kind of big ticket announcements. But then I also think about the president's digital transformation with Africa policy, which was immediately followed by Vice President Harris's call to action. And boy, was that call answered. And I think my colleagues on either side of me can say a bit about their leadership in some of the really transformational partnerships that followed that, women's inclusion in digital economy, the MAID Alliance. And these are incredibly hard-won partnerships that will project our policy goals and potentially have kind of generational impact for a long time to come. So I think both types are important, and we've really done our best to ensure that we are always communicating that we're kind of open for business.
Yeah, great. And as Andrew was mentioning earlier, this is also one of those kinds of partnerships which we definitely appreciate. And picking up on something that you said, related to the calls to action. There has been a great deal of momentum and activity over the last couple years in particular in that regard. And in addition to MAID, thinking about even prior to that, the Central America Forward call to action. And Stephanie, I'd like to turn to you. And I know that you were one of the architects / helped design, co-design Central America Forward. And so that was really, among many other things, looking at root causes of migration, how to foster inclusive growth locally. And so I'm curious from your perspective and being part of that design, how did you approach it and what were the core components of that?
Yeah, so thank you as well for having me here today. It's a wonderful audience and wonderful to be here. So first, we've definitely heard the call to action, Amanda, that you described for more private sector partnership. And I think what's unique is that increasingly we're seeing that private sector, including MasterCard, is no longer being asked just to write a check, but actually to think about what are the capacities, the technology, the expertise, the assets that we can bring to solve pressing development challenges all around the world. And importantly, to do so in a way that actually aligns to our core business interests as well, right? Thinking about our comparative advantage and our interests. So we did this in support of DTA with the MAID Alliance, as we talked about, and also with Central America Forward a few years ago. I think, when we talk about constructing these types of PPPs, one thing that makes them really unique and makes them also sustainable from a long-term perspective is that we're really thinking about commercial sustainability from the get-go and anchoring these programs around the private sector. So both with Central America Forward and with the MAID Alliance, we think about how do you have a private sector partner, a local private sector partner who is rooted in the community, and then you can crowd in all the other partners that you might need around that partner to bring funding and to bring complementary services that help bring that program to life. And what's really critical is that that local private sector partner has a plan for long-term commercial sustainability. Now, for private sector, sustainability obviously means profit, right? Some of our partners have a very long-term time horizon for break even and for profit. Other partners, especially when we start talking about local fintechs, local ag techs, local health techs, right? Agriculture and health in particular, these are markets and segments where margins are razor thin to begin with. That's where partnership with donors is really critical. So you can bring in that catalytic funding, but catalytic is really the key word here. It has to be the start, something that helps to de-risk private sector entry into those more challenging markets that we're looking at as part of both Central America Forward and the MAID Alliance, and then have a plan for how the private sector, with that initial upfront de-risking investment, can carry on the services when the grant might run out.
So you set that up very well for me to turn to you, Gargi. Curious, having heard that, and when you think about the role of catalytic funding and philanthropy, the work that's also being done by the Gates Foundation, you're an economist. And so I'd love to hear from your perspective the role that catalytic funding can play, and also what needs to be done to really foster inclusive growth that, as Stephanie mentioned, is sustainable and very much locally led.
Thanks for the question and for having me. I guess I would start by differentiating sustainability and self-sufficiency. Sometimes we get into public-private partnerships that do have a path to self-sufficiency. You're opening up a market, you're proving a concept that then has a revenue stream down the road. A lot of the times, the reason for the PPP is because the market wouldn't get there on its own. And in some of the work we do in healthcare in low-income countries around the world, we know the market isn't strong enough to compete with US consumers. And so the pipeline of research and development for the diseases of the poorest doesn't solve itself without a sort of partnership. Just to give you an example, one of the early investments that Gates made was into an organization called Gavi. The US is a partner as well. It's a global alliance to immunize children. And when we started that, it would take somewhere between 15 and 20 years for vaccines that our kids are getting here in this country to reach the poorest parts of the world. And that was because the market was unpredictable. People didn't really understand companies didn't understand how to introduce products. And so Gavi set a table where public health officials from low and middle income countries around the world. We're sitting with pharmaceutical companies, we're sitting with patient groups, physician groups, and together in sort of 20 years, we've immunized 1 billion children, we've created a robust pipeline of new vaccines, a wide range of products that are saving lives around the world. And that needs to continue, that we will move on from product to product, but that collaboration is kind of core to keeping the progress going.
So when you talk about sustainability of partnerships as well, curious, Amanda, how you're thinking about that. And when you're forging these partnerships, how are you thinking about them for the long term and ensuring that continuity over time?
Yeah, it's a challenging question. I mean, ensuring the continuity of really any policy over time can be challenging, given sort of the political fluctuations we're seeing and the tendency, I think, particularly when an administration changes, to abandon the old, even to rebrand the things that they decide to continue just for the sake of kind of ownership. So, you know, I think my colleagues have talked a little bit about this and the need to ensure that there's local buy-in, that you're not overly reliant, I would say, on sort of government support very often. And one of the things we've struggled with is just really basic capacity questions with respect to the kind of federal officials who are working on these things, and understanding that you know, there's a lot of pressure on them often to kind of launch something and then move on to the next project, particularly as priorities shift. So I think sometimes it's just knowing your limitations, being very clear up front about what we're able to offer and for how long, and figuring out if there's kind of a willing and capacious partner who's able to pick things up. Other times it's relying on the fact that many times our private and philanthropic sector partners actually have more predictable funding streams into the future than we do. And sometimes it's knowing that perhaps a partnership may be time-bound, and thinking very seriously about what you can accomplish in the time that you do have and that you can secure.
Yeah, and Stephanie, how are you thinking about that then? When, for example, with Community Pass, how have you engaged with partners at a local level and also recognize a potential timeline for that project so that there are investments, engagement, capacity building, but then also there may be a time horizon for that project where then you move on or expand elsewhere in the region?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll start by saying that inclusive growth and financial inclusion are a priority for MasterCard. For us, you know, in an increasingly digitized world, bringing more people and more businesses into the digital economy, it's not just the right thing to do, it's actually really good business for MasterCard. You take Africa as just one example, right? 90% of transactions in Africa are still in cash. And we know that Africa will be home to about half of the world's population growth over the next 30 years. That is a outsized secular opportunity for us to convert cash to digital payments, which means it's also a really good shareholder story for why MasterCard should invest into financial inclusion, invest into Africa. So from that perspective, we take a very long-term time horizon. If I go back almost a decade now, we started building out the Community Pass platform. In the early years, actually, we were de-risked by the Gates Foundation, and we've had a number of partnerships with Gavi and USAID and other actors over the years as well. What Community Pass aims to do is essentially build a digital infrastructure that enables service providers, including banks, governments, agricultural companies, to connect with the lowest income and the most remote communities. From a long-term perspective, this is seeding the market for MasterCard, right? Helping us to gain a foothold and convert those cash payments into digital payments. Cash is our biggest competitor, not any of the other brand names you might recognize. But also in the short term, right, there's not just that kind of long-term commercial perspective, but from a short-term perspective, there's real potential for inclusion, for impact. And so we work with a number of local and regional partners who leverage the Community Pass infrastructure. We're just the tech provider. They're actually providing a tailored service off the back of that digital infrastructure to the local communities. So for example, of our 6 million users, most of them are smallholder farmers. Those farmers use the digital credential that we provide through Community Pass and the digital profile to get access to larger markets with more local and more regional agricultural buyers. by having access to that larger market, that farmer now turns from a price taker to a price maker. We have farmers who report 25%, 50% higher prices. So it's good for the farmer. It's also good for the local buyer, the local bank, who now can reach a new segment of farmers in their community.
There's been increasing focus on digital public infrastructure, and we're talking about the investments in innovation, infrastructure, and access, and how they can really enable access and catalyze growth at a local level. And Gargi, I'd like to turn back to you, and when you think about that as it relates to the work of the Gates Foundation, and also where you're focused in addition to the important initiatives in health that you mentioned, what other areas are really ripe for this kind of public-private partnerships, involvement in government, private sector, and catalytic funding that philanthropy can provide? What are some other key areas that you're seeing really vital for action in this type of collaboration?
Yeah, well, I think the big story is how we restart growth and inclusive growth in the lowest income parts of the world and among the poorest. You started out by asking Amanda about the kind of political and economic situation. In 25 years of working in development, I have not seen it more fragmented and more complicated than today. The way we work ourselves out of the debt challenges facing Africa, the need to deliver development results, is by investing in inclusive growth. So I think, first of all, now is the time to double down on those investments, not back away from them. We need to be kind of engaging in dialogue and finding those partnerships. So when we think about how we contribute to a growth story, of course, fundamental for us is investing in people so they can be part of the growth story, and that's health, that's education. I think there's some super exciting places in education where we've gone through a round of just enrollment focus that made us realize that learning is actually a separate proposition than getting kids into seats. And so when you think about learning, there's so many exciting digitally enabled, but also analog ways to bring curriculum, teacher supports to enhance learning in the classroom in low income, low resource settings. We're really excited about that. But fundamentally, I think connecting countries in Africa and Asia to the digital infrastructure that is part of future growth is critical, starting with ID, data privacy, digital payments. But we know that the future of jobs is going to include a digital economy. And so we're really focused on how do you set the basics. You know, for many of us who've worked on infrastructure that has been defined as roads and pipelines, we now need to include digital infrastructure as part of that core growth agenda. So I think that is inherently a place where we need government regulation, investment, often donor catalytic resources. We need private sector innovators, all to come together to deliver that proposition.
And I think we really need to be realistic about the world that we live in. And you're right, the fragmentation that exists. And it's encouraging and heartening to hear kind of the doubling down on partnerships to really address that for greater engagement in the world and internationally amid that fragmentation, and how important that is now. We have a few minutes left, and you all have such tremendous experience and expertise. I'd really love to hear from each of you in your work in these areas and with partnerships, what have been some of the lessons learned? And I think that's part of this process as well, and that we want to understand what hasn't worked as well as Andrew was inquiring about earlier, and what adjustments have been made, and how have you adapted, and how have you refined your approach to make sure that in the work that you're doing, that you're having that local impact and that it's again sustainable. So I'd love to pick each of your brains for a little bit of knowledge and wisdom in that regard as well. Amanda, I'll go with you first.
Okay, great. So, I alluded to this before, but I think there just needs to be a sort of partnership-minded culture at any would-be partner organization. It has to be front of mind as a tool and something that at least some portion of the workforce feels ready to implement. And that sounds obvious for this sort of super experts on either side of me, but I think for emerging partners, it's really important. So one is doing what you can to build that culture and ensure that should the opportunities arise, there are people who sort of know how to write an MOU and have some models of what a partnership can look like. In terms of lessons learned, in government, we talked about this a little bit before, but I still think I speak to my colleagues about potential partnerships with either private or philanthropic partners, and I still think they kind of get dollar signs in their eyes, and they're we continue to sort of hone the idea that what partners bring to the table is a lot more sophisticated and diverse, and that the best partnerships are ones in which everybody's bringing their sort of core capacities to the table. And I think about following the second global COVID summit, we had partnerships in which the U.S. government was working with major drug manufacturers to offer some of their kind of emerging at the time therapeutics like Paxlovid to low and middle income countries at a concessionary price, assuming those countries could guarantee a minimum order, and it was philanthropies who were backstopping that. And that's an example of everybody doing what they're uniquely positioned to do. So learning from examples like that. I also think that it's important for us to not feel like a fervent enough policy argument is necessarily enough to get our partners on board. We really need to figure out why this is not only maybe a values match, but an interests match. I think private sector partners in particular are most amenable to a partnership in which they can actually see a business interest that they can bring back to their shareholders. And I think of the State Department's Coalition for Climate Entrepreneurs, where you have tech companies offering sort of enterprise level tech systems or equipment to emerging entrepreneurs around the world. And they are seeing market access and future clients. And we are seeing the growing and maturing of entrepreneurship ecosystems and potential climate technologies being wrought through these emerging businesses. And so thinking seriously about what your partner wants to get out of this and making the argument that will be most appealing to them. I think those are kind of some of our key lessons in government that again have been very hard won. I mean, they seem intuitive when I say them, they seem pretty obvious, but I feel like we are still making the case all the time. One last thought, and it's, I always tell my colleagues, if you are reaching out to someone for potential partnership, if you're making an ask, make sure that the last time you talked to them was not the last time you had an ask. Open up the lines of communication. You probably have a lot to talk about. We should be briefing. There should be opportunities to just update on our priorities. And the more you're just speaking regularly, the more likely you are to be able to identify these areas for partnership. And also, you just don't feel like a jerk all the time. So,
Absolutely, very important lessons learned. Stephanie, over to you. What are some ideas, wisdom, lessons learned that you could share with us today?
Sure. Well, I will definitely second your lessons learned as well. I'll pull lessons learned actually from going very far back in my private sector background, where I started my career was in retail and commerce, working on business experimentation, right? And our mantra was take a new idea, implement it in a small, controlled way, in a literal test and control environment, and then learn from it, iterate on it, and fail fast before you go and scale it, nationwide or across your store base or your customer base. And we've tried to emulate that idea of failing fast in our partnerships as well. I actually recently had a conversation with the head of a really remarkable foundation, and her charge was, let's stop making announcements about things that we want to do or things that we will do in this partnership. Let's actually talk about the actions we've implemented, and let's talk about the lessons we've learned, and most importantly, talk about what went wrong, what did we not do right, so that we can collectively share our learnings and not shy away from our own mistakes and actually share them with the broader sector in these partnerships. So that's what we're trying to do with the Made Alliance we just launched. We announced it in May. That was the start of the Made Alliance. And we have our first 2 programs, pilots, that are now going into the market. And we hope to share in the coming weeks some of those initial learnings with everybody as well about what we've done.
Great. Thank you, and appreciate the candor from everyone today. And that's how we all will learn and learn from all of you. And so Gargi, if you could take us home from your experience and all of the work that you've done around the world, what are some of those key lessons learned that you'd like to share with our audience today?
Sure. Well, I think the reality is we're all here for impact, but the risk with partnerships work is that, to use your analogy, it's neither the dinner party nor the marriage, but the champagne toast. We get to the announcement and then everybody scatters and does their own thing. And so for us, the lesson learned has really been about how you bed in the right incentives, the right follow-up to get to impact. And if I think about something like our work in neglected tropical diseases, it's an area where Merck has had a drug donation program for a drug against river blindness for many years, started under Roy Vagelos. How have they kept going for so many years? Well, it's taken a lot of effort by others, including us, to really help make this part of the Merck culture, to make sure employees year on year understand what a great thing this is and why it's part of the character of working at that company. The other part has been really bringing all the voices together. So in neglected tropical diseases, it's heavily philanthropically funded. How you keep philanthropists inspired and connected to the work when they might not have staff on the ground. And finally, just the impact happens at the end of the day because of local public health workers. I had dinner a couple months ago with a public health doc who works in West Africa for the NTD program, literally in long boots in rivers, testing the prevalence of worms in the river, and making sure that his voice is part of the planning so that we're not cooking something up here, but actually doing real things at the end of the day has been critical, and it inspires all of us to have those voices together.
Very well put, and absolutely vital to be inclusive in that planning process. Thank you for all of the lessons learned and your insights that you shared with us and for the impact that you continue to make. We're grateful for you being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.